So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Unfortunately, I can't see your faces. I see some familiar names in the participant list, but I hope you're all, having a good time. Smiles on your face, so on and so forth. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what it means to advance anti-racism across research and practice through partnerships. And my name is Sang Lee. I'm an assistant professor of qualitative methods at the Department of Educational Psychology, Leadership and Higher Education here at UNLV. And I'll be talking a little bit about work that is currently supported by the WT Grant Foundation and the NIAE at UNLV. I want to sort of start by talking a little bit about my core assumptions as a researcher, sort of and how that shapes the approach to research that I have, specifically around research practice partnerships. I want to present sort of a case of one of my sort of lines of work where I'm working with a teachers union chapter and teachers union leaders to sort of advance their anti-racist activism. I'm going to talk very briefly about some other applications to the work and then wrap up with some takeaways and questions and answers. If you have some questions along the way, please include them in the Q&A, and I'll be addressing them at the end of the presentation. So I bring this work in the context of some persistent sort of systemic exclusion and harm towards students of color in our education system, right? And the flip side of that being that there's a sort of an increasing desire among many educational actors, both researchers, school leaders, teachers, and students, right, to advance racial justice. And that obviously includes in universities as well. And there is relatedly, because this sort of problem, right, this wicked problem is so embedded in the systems and the context that we live in, there's a real sort of difficulty sustaining this work due to sort of this resistance at multiple levels. So, we have policy problems, issues of resources, issues of learning and knowledge, so on, and issues of identity even, right? And who we believe we are, and those kinds of things. So, there's a short way of sort of summarizing this, that there is just a lot of constraints to the work, and it makes the work very, very difficult. And there is a relative lack of knowledge on how we might build the kinds of infrastructures that could sort of cut through those constraints and sustain, especially collective anti-racist action, and build some of the sort of conditions that sustain that work, right? So I just kind of want to set the stage for the kind of work that I want to present with you today. A little bit about me. I couldn't find a good picture of me, so I just put a picture of my dog up there. But I am a former teacher who is now a researcher at UNLV. And so that is to say that I really bring sort of the ethos. I say, I'm always going to be a teacher at heart, right? So I really bring the ethos of what it means to be sort of an educator, working with students, every day. And sort of research to me is sort of a pathway into really impacting what happens in all the way from kindergarten all the way through higher education. And I really that's the sort of mindset that I take. I've been doing 15 years of anti-racist work in education. Since the moment I've entered the classroom, I've really sort of worn the hat of thinking about race and working towards sort of eliminating sort of the racist structures that are embedded in K-16 schooling. As a result, I really sort of engage in this approach to research called community engaged research, where I really think about the connection between research and the spaces where hopefully that research has an impact on, and doing that in a very sort of direct way, right? Not sort of a more roundabout way of hoping that there's sort of, the knowledge that we create sort of reaches folks, but really directly working with folks to think about, localized problems and working through those problems together. And I'm a first-time dog owner, so I'm obviously really obsessed with a dog at the moment. I mentioned some of these things already, but I want to sort of frame what this talk is going to be about and some of the ideas that I want to work through. Really, the big question is how do we build the conditions for researchers and practitioners to engage in anti-racist change together, right? That's sort of if you can leave today's talk having some newer ideas about how we might accomplish this, and if you feel motivated to do this, I would consider that a win for myself. And this comes from sort of the core assumption that anti-racist change occurs when we build collaborative infrastructures that allow us to sort of apply what we know about anti-racism in a really local capacity, right? And I believe that that occurs through sort of transformation at three levels. One is institutions and policy and politics related to that, right? So sort of happening this at the so working at the macro level. The second level is the local activity, right? So how do people like you and I work together to really change the way that we work, change the way that we go about our business, right? And then the third piece is our identity. So how do we see our roles in this, and how do we see our position within this, our knowledge, the way that we approach our practices, so on and so forth, right? And I want to sort of focus on, okay, then how, right? How do we engage in that change? Well, the first sort of idea that I want to bring to everybody's attention here is really partnerships, right? So how do we do this together? And, you know, my assumption being that it can't be done unless we really build really concrete sort of collaborative structures across different stakeholders. The second piece is localization. So how do we do that in a way that really targets the spaces that we occupy? And then the third piece is how do we connect theory to action, and in a cyclical way that both informs each other, right? I will talk a little bit about the kinds of I guess, services or assets that researchers could offer in this process. And once again, this is just to kind of encourage you to think about how you might work with researchers to accomplish the things that you are trying to push forward, right? In trying to bring racial justice into this world. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of give an overview of what is it that I do as a researcher, and especially as a methodologist, right? I was hired at UNLV to for my my expertise in research methods, among a couple other things, but primarily my research methods. And I use something called participatory design as a core research process. And when I say that, I mean participatory design as a way to build theory about anti-racism in research, and also as a way to change our practices and change the outcomes very directly, right? So there's both sort of a research stance and a theory development stance, and then also a sort of an activist stance, right? Wanting to get my hands dirty and really sort of build the kinds of practices in educational institutions that change the outcomes for students and color. So this comes from two assumptions, and hopefully sort of these assumptions about me sort of sort of bleed into the way that I talk about the specific work that I do. But one is my assumptions about racial justice. What is important? What is needed? Well, one thing is that we need to build it on community assets and sort of the narratives that don't always float to the top, right? Or that are made most visible in the systems that we work in. The second piece is that anti-racist work requires attention from the micro all the way to the macro. So I mentioned that already a little bit, but we can't really sustain our anti-racist work unless we pay careful attention to the micro level context all the way to the macro level. And then the third piece is that we really need to connect carefully and intentionally the theory, what we know about anti-racism and race, sort of at the theoretical level or conceptual level into action, right? And sort of specific context. And I also, as a learning scientist, I have some assumptions about how we learn, right? And I think learning is a really key component of this. So one assumption that I hold about learning is that learning is very much situated. It only happens in relationship to the context that we live in and we work in. The second thing is that, and these are sort of core tenets, right, that we know about learning. The second thing is that community drives learning, that we we really only learn through the interaction that we have with others, whether that's an online space, for example, teams, organizations, communities, our cultures, and so on and so forth, right? And then the final piece is that learning, once again, there's a real connection between putting theory into action and then building theory from action, right? And what all that means is that I engage in this process of working with multiple stakeholders and identifying sort of shared goals and problems that are localized and designing implementations, designing interventions and implementing them in those contexts, right, with alongside my research partners. And then we study those designs and the implementation of those designs to see if there are continuous improvements that we can make to those designs so that we can continuously sort of iteratively and cyclically see if we can sort of move the needle on these specific outcomes that we've identified as sort of manifestations of our anti-racist goals, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to share a little bit more of a specific example that might sort of bring to ground what that process might look like. But I just kind of want to add an important caveat that this sort of necessitates a higher standards of ethics, right? When we engage in this kind of interventionist research. So something that I really try to think about and ground myself to is first a deep sort of consideration for researcher ethics, right, and decision making. Really thinking about the potential harm, the potential benefits of the kinds of research and the way that we interact with stakeholders might sort of facilitate, right? The second thing is that we need to really build sort of structures and processes that ensure sort of that due diligence, right? Especially for those who are probably most affected by the research and the sort of collective work that we do, research and design work that we do, and also for those who are sort of often most excluded from shaping our educational systems, right? And then finally, that data collection and analysis is done to serve both, yes, research and researchers, but also practitioners, right? And I think there's a very strong case that, research that really, or activity and partnerships that serve both are really, really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I want to talk about a line of work that I'm currently engaging in with the support of the WT Grant Foundation. Um, it's a case study of supporting anti-racist activism of teachers union leaders, and this is some work that is happening in Southern California with some of my colleagues, such as Dr. Jun An at UC Irvine and Dr. Kim Gomez at University of California, Los Angeles. And this is part of a larger study to examine how different ways of partnerships or different configurations of partnerships between researchers and practitioners engaging in anti-racist work together might lead to different ways of different outcomes, right? Different anti-racist outcomes in school settings, in educational settings. So to give you a little bit of background, we are partnering with a teachers union chapter in California engaging in anti-racist activism. This is a group of about 15 teachers who have formed their own committee to advance racial justice and social justice in their school district through teacher leadership, right? And this work they had started the work about since 2019, so before the pandemic, identifying a need to push this agenda forward, understanding that the teacher demographics often did not match up with the students, right, in this particular school district. And, a few teacher leaders really leading from a desire to sort of really to change or to to respond to that, right? And so how do we sort of move as a union teachers to once again engage in real sort of anti-racist work in their classrooms? And the existing union-led work focused primarily on when we met them, so to speak. It primarily focused on conceptual change about race among sort of this small group of teachers. So what I mean by that is, and we see this a lot, right? Things like um, book studies, right? Engaging in sort of professional development about maybe the teacher's own positionalities in relation to maybe race and racism in schools. Sort of this really trying to understand their own thinking, their own roles, and their own practices at a really sort of conceptual level. So you can make the argument that they were sort of doing this really theoretical work on their own, right? But when we met them, they were talking about this struggle to move the work into a really action and systemic change effort, right? So how do we take what we're learning and we're increasingly realizing about race and racism in schools? How do we actually convert that into concrete action that leads to change, right? As a group. So, this is a sort of quotation from a teacher, one of the teacher leaders. She said, a lot of it has been in the awareness space, right? Not so much into action and change steps. We want to do big picture mapping of goals, and I want you to fill gaps, you as in the researchers, fill gaps in workshops and facilitation. And then data. How can we adapt to collect data to monitor change, right? So this is sort of the space that we came into. So how do we do that, right? That was sort of our partnership focus. How do we create the infrastructures to sustain anti-racist change of teacher leaders? Well, the first thing that we did, and this is where we get into the sort of nitty gritty that maybe some of you here could take away in the work that you do, and this, these processes are by no means comprehensive, right? These are just some things that you can try and things that worked in our case, right? And hopefully that'll have some relevance to you. Well, the first thing that we did is mapping the local context, right? So really thinking about how do we, what is the work, what is the context that we work in? And this is built on work by DM and colleagues, published in 2022, arguing that any anti-racist activism is always situated at the intersection of policy, community, leadership, and teaching and learning, right, in education. So, for example, policy is obviously things like what kinds of policy, for example, what is the what kind of coursework is mandated in schools at the policy level? Maybe that's state policy. Maybe what kind of at the local level, what kind of curriculum does the school board decide to purchase for the use of teachers, right? What is their policy in regards to the implementation of such curriculum, so on and so forth, right? Community really means both sort of the community that surrounds the educational institutions and the educational spaces. So, for example, what is the demographics of the community that we work in? What is the politics of those people? What is the history of the community that surrounds the educational spaces, right? But I think it also means community within certain organizations, right? So, for example, I mentioned earlier that this particular school district really was trying to grapple with the fact that its own teaching community didn't always see race as a important sort of mediator of access to education, right, and quality education. So, what is the nature of the community that is there? The third piece is leadership. So, how are decisions being made? What kind of individuals sort of lead the charge? What is the makeup of the leadership? So on and so forth. And then teaching and learning, I think both in terms of what educational practitioners might need to learn for themselves as a way to sort of understand the context that they work in better, but also obviously what is the kind of teaching and learning that is offered to the students, right, in an educational context. So in this work, we really sort of mapped out what we understand about the context in a sort of systematic way into these four categories. So in this case, at the policy level, there's this real awareness of the national and local anti-critical race theory movement, right? I mean, I would argue that these people who are against this, they don't actually really know what what critical race theory is, but they're against it anyway, and they're beginning to make some noise and also engage in some real policy. They're threatening certain policies, right? In the case of California, however, also understanding that a lot of policies are supportive of racial justice work, such as curricular frameworks and recent ethnic studies mandates. So understanding that in the context in which they work in, these teachers probably are not as worried about sort of maybe what they might be worried in Florida and Texas and such, but still sort of understanding that there's always a threat, right? And then realizing, although there's California state level protections, that at the school board level, there's an increasing sort of makeup that is against public school teachers and against the idea of offering the kind of educational experiences that focus on social justice and racial justice, right? At the community level, once again, I mentioned this, but recognizing that they are serving a community of color as a school district, but that there's sort of a split teaching force, right? So on the one hand, there are teachers who are really invested in the idea of pushing for racial justice in the curriculum and their practices. But on the other hand, they're also recognizing that there are teachers who are not as sort of ready to engage in that work, right? And then there's also, even when teachers do want to engage in this work, that there is sort of a fear of pushing for racial justice within their schools. And finally, sort of that the community or the union has not always really thought about their responsibility to the community in an intentional way. In terms of their leadership, they talked about national level and local level shifts in union leadership. So how broader at the national level, the union is creating structures to, for example, fund anti-racist work by local chapters. At the local level, how the union leadership has just changed over to a woman of color who is really open about wanting to push forward anti-racist work as a union, right? However, also seeing that there isn't always the warmest support from the district leadership. So understanding they have to sort of navigate that relationship, right? And then they've created this new leadership structure called the Human Rights and Equity Committee, the group that we worked with, where they're really engaging in this sort of work in a targeted way, right? And then finally, and once again, this is mentioned a little bit, but sort of understanding that teachers sort of didn't have as much of a strong knowledge base about racial justice focused educational work, and that as a result, the in-class curriculum and pedagogy is often colorblind, or focused on sort of what we call like heroes and holidays, right? Sort of the kind of light reference to sort of diversity that doesn't really get to some of the systemic structures that sustain racism in schools. So step one was really mapping this out, right? And what this allowed us to do is really think about what are the long-term goals given the context that we work in, and then how do we, right? We can't just snap our fingers and sort of change the system, right? But by understanding the local context, being able to map out a clear sort of longitudinal strategy for systemic change. So in the long term, what the teachers collectively decided and where they thought they could sort of, they could, given the leverage points, could actually sort of realistically work towards is for all classrooms across all grade levels to integrate ethnic studies and social justice frameworks into their curriculum, right? And that's ambitious, but given their understanding of the context, that is something that they feel is doable, right? However, in phase one, the assumption was that unless we activate teachers and understand that they have certain rights and responsibilities and related to teaching for racial justice, this work, there's no work there at all, right? We need teachers to get started. Number two, then once we activate teachers, is instructional capacity development. So building the kinds of learning processes and structures for teachers to really embrace and integrate, right, ethnic studies and social justice frameworks into their classroom. And then number three is a larger sort of macro level fight to reach out to the community, communicate with them effectively what the teachers are trying to accomplish, that hopefully the community members will be on board with, as a way to also build a more robust school board that supports the kind of racial justice focused work that they want to undertake in. So that's the three-phase plan, so to speak, right? Now, I want to zone in on phase one and really think about, okay, well, how do we design for teachers to activate sort of their journey towards racial justice work by more deeply understanding their rights and responsibilities, right? So what we did was we used something called an equity conjecture map. This is a piece that I've published in the context of another work, and it's a way to map out sort of mapping out what you're going to do, right? The designs of your interventions. And it starts with really thinking about what are our biggest assumptions about how equity and racial justice happens, right? Number two is then thinking about, well, then how can we move people, right? How do people learn to think about and move towards those outcomes, right? That we are moving towards. And then we think about what are the kinds of tools, processes, structures that we need to build in order to sort of sustain that learning, right? In people that we want these designs to touch. And then finally, thinking about, okay, well, what should those tools do, right? When we design certain kinds of professional development, when we design certain kinds of tasks, when we design certain kinds of participant structures, what kinds of processes should that mediate, right? What should it facilitate? What kind of interactions? What kind of activity should folks be engaged in, right? And then what kind of learning does that outcome? What kind of outcomes does that learning sort of lead to? So once again, I know this is a little bit big picture, so I want to sort of tie it into the work that we're doing with the teachers, right? So once again, stage one, going all the way to the right-hand side, we had decided that teachers' sense of safety and responsibility in relationship to anti-racist work was a really sort of important outcome to trigger, right? And that teachers are activated to sort of engage in the next phase of the real learning, right? Where the sort of where they really get their hands dirty, right? But before they do that, they needed to feel safe. They needed to understand what kind of responsibilities they have, and then they had to tell themselves, "Okay, I'm ready to go on this learning journey," right? I'm starting all the way in the outcomes because then we had to sort of build some high-level sort of ideas about, okay, well, what do we believe about anti-racism, right? Well, one thing that we believe at the high level is that teachers need to understand their rights and responsibilities to be invested in anti-racist change, that the safety and responsibility was a really core component of teachers' change processes. Okay, so how do we think they're going to learn, right? How do we think they're going to get there, right? Well, we think that if teachers understood better the state's awareness of the state's educational policies, how that gets enforced, and also how the union is there to protect their rights, right, will allow them to sort of feel that sense of safety, right, and feel that sense of responsibility. So what did that mean? Well, we created this training program for teachers that is union-led, that focuses on their rights and responsibilities at the specific state context, scenarios for how they could defend themselves and protect themselves when they feel threatened, right, from the larger community, their peers, maybe certain members of the community, so on and so forth, and including what the union will do in situations like that. We created a resource library and other trainings for teachers to, once they get activated, kind of move into. And then finally, we have the union leadership team that the teachers can always come to when there's sort of a gap, right? We wanted that to connect. We wanted what we wanted that to do was we wanted teachers to connect policy to their teaching context, right? So understanding that, okay, we have this policy that's friendly towards the kind of work that I want to do. I'm good to go, right? We also wanted to them to understand that there's this pathway to different sort of a deeper learning. So we wanted to structure it so that once teachers get activated, that there's a place that they can go to. We also wanted to develop a sense of trust in union protections, and then also for teachers to sort of build this identity as sort of a policy implementer, right? That, okay, there's this, for example, ethnic studies is going to be a requirement in California. How can I play a role in being an implementer of that policy, even if I'm not a high school teacher, for example, right? How can I sort of build work so that students are ready to do, students and teachers are ready to engage in that work, right? So building out sort of a collective theory of change, and this allows us to study, right? Well, okay, before I get there, so this is kind of a sort of an example of, a slide from the training, right? What these assumptions above might look like in practice. And this is just a little tiny snippet, but you can see that part of the training is really talking about what the California state policies are, and also what the union is willing to sort of work towards, right? When teachers feel threatened. But what this sort of sense making and developing sort of this collective theory of change allows us to do is that it allows us to learn and allows us to collect data. So once we implemented the initial design of the training, right, the rights and responsibilities training, what we did then was we ran a series of focus groups and asked the teachers for their, hey, are we really, making you feel safe? Are we really giving you this sense of responsibility to engage in this sort of learning process, right? And do you feel sufficiently activated to sort of move through that sort of pathway? And what we learned was that teachers really wanted a deeper understanding of the historical and political sort of context in which they worked in. So they really actually wanted to learn more about, for example, what role have teachers played in the development of ethnic studies? What have unions been able to do to push for racial justice forward, and how have they done that, right? Because this union hadn't engaged in that kind of work before, so they wanted sort of these historical examples. So we brought that back. Thought about, okay, well, what kind of knowledge can we add to the original training? And the training had become something that's much more focused on the sort of history of union activism in social justice spaces. And that has led to even better sort of reception from the teachers, right? So that's what sort of externalizing these ideas that we have about change could do, right? It can guide the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we collect data, and also sort of think about what kind of change, right, is happening in the local setting. And in this process, what the researcher, primarily myself in this case, right, could do, right, in this partnership context is first be a facilitator, right, for example, things like design activities, right, like the one that I just shared, externalizing our assumptions and really making it a strategic sort of process, right? We could help frame things, right? Once again, framing our assumptions about design into sort of a sort of key learning process. And then we can broker. What I mean by that is we could also connect different actors among each other and really think about how do we push forward a collective agenda together, right? We also often act as translators. So, in this case, we brought in a lot of theory about learning, but also about historical sort of examples of union activism, teacher activism about ethnic studies, and so on. Right. We can also translate across stakeholders oftentimes. This not as applicable in this example, but for example, we might often play the role of translating across parent groups and teachers, for example. And then we can also translate across disciplines. So once again, in this case, we have an eye towards things like ethnic studies, right? But we also have our eye towards things like learning theory, right? Theories of design, so on and so forth. And then finally, we can sort of act as archivists, so to speak. So we obviously are collecting data. We are representing that data in certain ways, like the visuals that we developed. And then we can sort of keep a historical account of how this work developed. And I think that has a big contribution to the way that we can sort of build on the work on an ongoing basis. And then the final process is, we don't want to neglect the research, right? Or the big R research, or the traditional research as we think about it. And what I mean by that is, what can we publish in sort of in the research arena, so that what we're doing at the local level can really inform what happens more broadly, right? And I think we've given ourselves an opportunity to help people think about questions like, how do emergent anti-racist activism efforts build sort of the infrastructures that respond to these multi-level contexts, right? I think that's a really important contribution. How does research get utilized in racial justice focused partnerships, right? How does anti-racist activism by teachers become more politicized or historicized, right? I think these are the kinds of questions that we are able to answer through because we have the privilege of working with folks who are really doing the work on the ground and contributing to that process alongside them. So there are many, and I just shared one application of this, but there are many other applications that I'll just kind of go through some different areas of work that I've participated in the past. In one work, I've co-designed sort of the local school technology practices with the help of immigrant background students who attended that school, right? So really thinking about how do we make the technologies that are being increasingly available in school settings, how do we make that really work for students, and particularly students of color? So that was sort of one approach, and really thinking about, what are the structures required to sustain student participation, and also what kinds of outcomes the students want, and what kind of outcomes do particular kinds of technology designs facilitate. In another line of work, we've co-designed computer science curriculum for elementary school students with elementary school teachers, right? So really thinking about, well, what are the kinds of things that elementary school teachers are grappling with in this relatively new field that they weren't necessarily trained to teach early in their careers, right? So, how do we really build out deep learning in computer science classrooms, and how do we sort of build the kind of curriculum that could facilitate that with teachers, with the insight of teachers who are expert teachers, but relatively new to the computer science space. In another example, we've developed a machine learning system that represents classroom dialogue into a visual data representation, so that teachers can think about, and this is a really important issue because oftentimes classrooms that serve students of color, their interactive practices and discourse practices are often not as essentially intellectual, right? So what we tried to do here was help teachers see sort of what their discourse practices in science classrooms look like, and put that in conversation with their assumptions about equity and racial justice, and then to engage in an ongoing learning process to change their classroom discourse practices, right? And once again, working with teachers and also a multidisciplinary research team to build all these sort of tools required to accomplish that task, right? And then finally, this is really relevant to UNLV, but currently, and this is not at UNLV, but we are working with a Anapeasy, a minority serving institution, um, who has received a federal Anapeasy grant to think about how do we actually use this money to serve AAPI students, right? How do we actually develop culturally relevant practices? How do we actually develop practices that students want? So we're working with both program developers, program managers, the PIs of the Anapeasy grant, who are amazing faculty members, but they are English professors, right? So they're not as experts in thinking about, okay, how do we build practices of higher education that support a particular student group. So we're working with them to, like I said, design specific practices that are really intended to serve AAPI students, and then think about how we can continue to improve those practices through ongoing data collection, analysis, and then redesign. So that is sort of yeah, that's just another example that we're currently working on. So you can kind of see that sort of these same ideas have applications in a lot of different spaces, right? And I imagine you'd be able to find something there too. So some takeaways. First, it's about turning ideas into action, right? We need to sort of engage in dynamic anti-racist work that is really responsive to local context. So when we're really trying to sustain our work, I believe that we need to sort of engage in this really dynamic process of understanding the local context and being responsive to that local context, right? To do that, I think this iterative study of theory to action and then action to theory is a really effective learning mechanism that could sort of really help us engage in dynamic anti-racist work. And then finally, there's a role for research practice partnerships. I think there's an important role for research practice partnerships to play in that local change-making effort that could travel all the way to sort of theory development as well as policy change, right, in the long run. So I'm going to take a break there. We'll do questions, Q&A, but before I move there, I want to quickly advertise our next Scholarship in Practice series by Dr. Johnson, Expanding Students' Worldviews, Assessing and Activating Globalization at Colleges and Universities. And that'll be at May 1st from 4 to 5 p.m. So I hope everybody here will have an opportunity to attend. And that's it from me. I would love to answer some questions if there are any. I'm going to open up the chat. Or please feel free to raise your hand. And I believe Mr. Kim will unmute you to ask questions as well. Okay, I'm seeing one question. Are there any research partners you're familiar with here at UNLV that would be a good benchmark for anti-racist practices? So sorry, I'm trying to make sense of this question a little bit. So are there any research partners you're familiar with? So I'm assuming you're asking if I know any sort of practitioner organizations that that are engaging in this kind of work. I think I want to flip the script a little bit, right? I think one thing that I really hope folks take away from this talk is this idea that there's some core actions and practices that we know do good things, right, for students of color and communities of color. However, I sort of I feel hesitant to sort of think about partners in terms of whether they are hitting a particular kind of benchmark because these are all sort of learning processes, right? And so I would say that in any work like this, I think the most important sort of initial consideration is to think about, well, where are people, right? Where are people and what are the kinds of assets that they bring? Where are and of course, like, where are some of the gaps in relation to what we know about good practices, but really thinking dynamically about how do we actually set them up for success, right? How do we set them up for learning? How do we set them up for development? How do we set them up for evolution and then transformation, right? So really thinking about I guess I think of it more as when I see sort of potential partners that I'm trying to work with, I think about sort of how are they going to learn? Not so much, and part of that question is, of course, what are they good at and where are some gaps? But I think that's probably the way that I think about it. Um, I have a question. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Okay. Jen, do you think these tips can translate into advancing anti-racism research in other fields of study, science, hospitality, etc., or is this geared towards research and education? Oh, I love that. I absolutely. I think like as I've kind of talked through some of these examples, right? I mean, yes, like a lot of this stuff is in the education space, but I mean, this work, for example, it's really it has implications for AI research, machine learning research too, right? Like, I think that's a really easy example of sort of where this kind of work could but if you could do it there, I think you could do it essentially anywhere, right? I can see this kind of work having a lot of value, and it has been done in spaces like healthcare, right, and public health. I think it could be, there's a lot of work like this that could be advanced. I mean, name the field, right? I think it can be done. So, I unless you have some ideas about where maybe it can't be done, but I can't necessarily think of one right off the bat. I have one more question. Um, Thank you so much for this presentation. My interest is in the area of the non-traditional student and the lack of equity within higher education in reference to institutional policies and practices that create an equity gap. Do you feel one can use your framework to apply to non-traditional student research? Yes, and I think once again, and depending on, I think depending on the goals, right? The context is going to be a little bit different, right? So and I'm not an expert in non-traditional students, but I imagine for non-traditional students there are very specific policy contexts that sort of right really impact their day-to-day lives. I imagine there are particular sort of uh, characteristics of the community that, once again, really shape their day-to-day lives in education. Same with certain leadership structures that are in place, and the kinds of things that maybe those leaders or practitioners and students themselves, right, need to sort of teach and learn. So I think you know as a first step, I think to sustain this kind of work with non-traditional students, it's really about mapping this out and understanding, what is the really local work that needs to be done. And I'll add that oftentimes when you really map out the local, more times than not, other people are, experiencing some version of the same problem, right? And has sort of a way of being able to um, really help others solve their issues too, even if it's in a different setting. Okay, I have one more question on the Q&A and then one question in the chat. So I'll start with the Q&A. Thanks for these types of topics. There's always something new to learn. Oh, thank you. Okay. Uh, Here's a question. I'm curious about how you decided on what content to include to support the teacher's request for more historical and political context. How did you go about this process? Oh yeah, so that's yeah. So I didn't touch on this, but in the original version of the training, there was a very sort of there was a because part of it we wanted teachers to understand sort of what people mean when they say critical race theory, right? Because part of sort of this fear was about sort of not knowing what it really is, right? So there's a little snippet of a video that our teacher partners found that was talking about sort of uh, policy, redlining, historical sort of redlining policies and the impact that that has on sort of, wealth today and, so on and so forth, right? And it was sort of it wasn't sort of, I mean, it wasn't about necessarily teachers. It wasn't necessarily about teachers' political activism, so on and so forth. But when we conducted these focus groups, we were really struck by how teachers just consistently told us that that was just so eye-opening and that sort of like blew their minds, right? And it was honestly knowledge that I sort of thought, oh, surely everybody knows this, right? But turns out that's not really the case. So we really noticed that in the responses of the teachers, and we still didn't know if teachers really wanted like to position themselves in sort of historical knowledge per se, right? But we kind of used that insight to go on a whim, and we said, hey, maybe it seems like they really like this knowledge about sort of, how these historical systems have been created. It seems like there's something about this historical knowledge that teachers are really latching onto. And it could have been a number of things, right, that they really latched onto. So we had to do a little bit of guesswork. But the beauty of it is that, when this kind of way of doing things allows us to do a little bit of guessing work, right? We need to try things. And so what we said was, hey, I think it's because this historical knowledge, we think that it might be even more effective in regards to the outcome that we want, right? Teachers developing this sense of their rights and responsibilities to engage in this kind of work. Well, what if, given the outcome that we want, what if we actually brought more historical knowledge about teachers into the fold and really focused on like teachers' historical sort of activism and their role in all of this, right? So that was a bit of a hunch, right? And so we included a few more. We included a lot more. We expanded on that. We included a lot more sort of moments where teachers can think about, their historical role in sort of these political movements. And this is really good. It was one of my favorite moments of this partnership, right? Like, at the end of that session, we did another number of focus groups as well, and like the teachers were just so just so activated by that particular part where we're talking about the union history and the role that unions have played in sort of social justice movements, and just repeatedly we heard, oh man, like I didn't know teachers, I didn't know teachers have done this. Oh man, like how do we engage in this process, right? Like, so it kind of felt like it was a really sort of validating moment for us, right? And I think that's just to kind of add a little thing about research, like that's its own form of kind of rigor, right? In research, we think of rigor in research as sort of highly technical sort of ideas about how to bring rigor into our data analysis, but I think there's this relevance to practitioners and the way that it changes sort of their thinking about their profession and the fact that that was sort of what we had sort of theorized, right? Like I think that is its own form of like really deep rigor that I think we need to pay more attention to in research. Um, okay, I'm seeing one more question. Okay, can you speak about research partnerships where anti-racism topics were not initially incorporated, but maybe through conversation it was discovered this was going to be a focus? Are partners hesitant to go there? Yeah, or maybe let me see. I can't say that I've ever been part of partnerships that didn't have that angle to start with, but there have been examples where maybe the tools that were available to push that work forward maybe weren't always available, right? So going back to this work over here, um, so we we initially this tool didn't actually specifically ask teachers to think about equity in the classroom when looking at their classroom data. Part of the assumption was that that is part of what teachers just naturally think about, right? How wrong we were. So we actually had designed greater sort of on the right side you see this kind of triangle outside of this. Oh, actually, sorry, all the way to the left, right? We asked teachers specifically to sort of state like their thinking about equity and and how that sort of connects to their context, and then we asked them to look at their data in relationship to sort of their ongoing noticings, right, about equity. So what am I trying to say here? So what I'm trying to say is that what's on the far left on this screen and on the far right, that didn't used to exist in this the design of this app, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, I think where the thinking is not very deep about these topics, I think once again, when we go back to thinking about, okay, what does this context need? How do we respond to the very specific sort of context that folks are working in? I think it allows us to build tools, right, and designs that are really respond, right, in a targeted way into that sort of lack of conversation or fear or whatever have you, right? And likewise, the work that I primarily focused on, right? The broader teaching base, not as comfortable talking about this, right? And that's why we started with, okay, how do we actually help teachers feel safe and start this work? Um, I think we might be time might be up. Thank you so much for joining me here. I had so much. I wish I could see everybody's faces so that I can, really, really kind of interact with you. But I believe, but thank you so much for being here. And please reach out. My email, sorry, I forgot to put my email down here, but my email is available on the UNLV website if you have any more questions. And I believe Mr. Kim has some closing slides to share.